Every year around this time, the same thing happens. People wondering if they have the desire and the skills to enter a new way of life come together. And they meet with those who at the same time, having lived that way of life, come to hone again their skills. And the young and the old and new, and those who are already pros at this, come together to form a team. I'm talking, of course, about spring training in baseball. I would like to suggest to all of us that perhaps that is not as blasphemous as it sounds. And that maybe we ought to be seeing Lent as our own form of spring training. So often, and especially I tend to think the readings of the first Sunday of Lent lead us to that. We tend to see Lent as something separated from the rest of our lives. That somehow, while we sort of see ourselves as pretty good the rest of the year, we'll call ourselves sinners during these 40 days. And we will do things, make sacrifices that we wouldn't do during the rest of the year to let us know that this somehow is a special season. But what if we saw this season not as something different, but actually our own spring training? What happens in spring training? First of all, you see a lot of people you normally would not have seen, all these rookies who come to play, who try to understand what it is, this new way of life of pro baseball, and ask themselves, do they have both the desire and the skills ready? I would never call people in our RCIA rookies, but isn't that the same question that you all have? Do I have the desire? Do I have the skills? And for those who have been playing for a while, what do? They intensify their practice, their discipline in pitching, in hitting, in fielding. And it's interesting that Lent calls us ourselves to practice 3 different skills. As we listen to the temptation of Jesus, we hear those temptations deal with bread and stone, with having power over kingdoms, and having or not having a relationship to God. Aren't those 3 temptations of Jesus the 3 questions we constantly have in our Christian lives? What is our relationship to the things that we have? Is it stuff that we use as we want, the way we want, for what we want? Or, as we listen to today's second reading, is it somehow acknowledging the abundance that God gives us? And so we fast, not somehow to get God to like us, but to acknowledge that perhaps in that abundance we ought to use only what we need, that others may have a share as well. The temptation of power. Doesn't it tell us about our relationship with one another, sisters and brothers, daughters and sons of God? And that the attempt to lord it over one another, to have power over those 12 kingdoms that the devil tempts Jesus to do, is not what this is about at all. But that our Christian life is not a life of power over one another, but service toward one another. And we give alms, again, not to put us above, but to share what we have, that we might all be one together. And the third temptation, the temptation to tempt God's own love. Throw yourself off the tower and see if God saves you. Might be the most frightening and most tempting temptation of all. Does God really love me? Does God really care? And so I pray. And sometimes I don't really pray, but I say prayers. And my own fear in myself is sometimes I say prayers so I don't have to pray. Because once I pray, I put myself in God's hands. I tell God that I trust God in whatever happens. And once I do that, I don't know where it's going to lead. Those skills that we practice at Lent ought not be things that we do for 40 days every spring, but it should be our own spring training in the life of God. And it's interesting because part of what spring training in baseball is about is forming the team. And part of what Lent is about, I think, is allowing us to form more closely in community, more closely in our right relationship with the things we have, more closely in the right relationship with one another, more closely in the right relationship with our God. So I'd like to suggest that maybe the spring training analogy is not blasphemous at all, and it might be a pretty good idea of what this Lent ought to be, so that come Easter time, we could all be great pros in our Christian faith.